Merry Christmas from my Nerd World of Star Wars podcast. Before we get underway with the show this week, I want to tell you about a fantastic new podcast that I discovered that I think you're really going to enjoy. Now, whether you're a bourbon or whiskey fan, you're definitely going to want to check out this podcast. But if you like finding out about things that you never knew anything about, but you find it in a podcast and it's incredibly compelling because the hosts are really into it and they're fantastic hosts, and then suddenly you get into a topic that you never knew you had any interest in, that's what makes a good podcast. And that's what happened with me in Bourbon Pursuit. Now, I'm more of a rum fan, but as we head into and as I start off my Christmas vacation, while I was planning on going out and buying some rum, I think I'm actually going to get some bourbon, because I now know which bourbon to buy after listening to Bourbon Pursuit. It is the official podcast of bourbon. If you find yourself, like for me, going to the store, looking at all the bourbon on the store shelves and don't know where to start, right? You can find out where to start with Bourbon Pursuit. Do you enjoy bourbon but want to know more about the science, history, and the stories behind the label? The hosts, Kenny Coleman, Ryan Cecil, and Fred Minnick, they do a fantastic job of telling compelling stories with fantastic commentary and conversation, and they take you on an epic bourbon adventure. Bourbon is distinctive. It's a distinctive product of the United States. I didn't know that. It can't be produced anywhere else. And not all bourbon is made in Kentucky. I learned all this on the Bourbon Pursuit podcast. It's the best source for all bourbon news, reviews, and interviews with people making the bourbon whiskey industry happen. And they have 3 new episodes each week. I love the taste test that they do, listening to the fantastic hosts try out bourbons and whiskeys they've never had before and telling their own experiences right there on the podcast. It really makes for a fantastic listening experience. Learn about the next bourbon trends, the personalities behind your favorite brands, and hear interviews with industry influencers, retailers, celebrities, unique consumers who are on the hunt for rare bourbons. You can take your knowledge, like I did, from being a complete bourbon novice to a bourbon baron. Wherever the good stuff is poured, Bourbon Pursuit is just a play button away. Subscribe and follow Bourbon Pursuit wherever you get your podcasts. All right, on the Star Wars podcast this week, what is Tales of the Jedi? Kind of came out of nowhere. I'll tell you what this is all about, or at least what I know about it, what the speculation is behind it. Also, some exclusive interviews have come to light, been released over the course of the past week, from Rogue One director Gareth Edwards and science fiction guru Jon Knoll. So I'll share you some bits and pieces and my own commentary from these interviews as we celebrate Star Wars over the holiday season, and talk a little bit about why Christmas time is Star Wars time, especially in the Disney era, but it really always kind of has been. Plus your listener feedback as well. All right, let's get to a very special Merry Christmas, My Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast.
It's an instinct. A feeling. The Force brought us together. We're not alone. Good people will fight if we lead them.
People keep telling me they know me. No one does.
But I do.
Long have I waited. And now you're coming together. Is your undoing.
Confronting fear is the destiny of a Jedi. Your destiny. The Force will be with you.
Always.
My Nerd World.
It is my Nerd World of Star Wars podcast, and I am your host, Jon Justice. Merry Christmas to you, as I am currently on Christmas vacation, and if you're listening to this on Christmas Day, wow, that's weird. Either way, I hope you're having a fantastic Christmas and a great New Year as we head into to 2022, and I hope wherever you are happy, you are healthy, and you are safe. Got some ground to cover on the show this week, so let's start here, all right?
The hyperdrive is leaking.
So there's been a couple of leaks this week, and I'm going to be really vague on one of these, at the time of the writing of this podcast, we're some 4 or 5 days away from the release of the book of Boba Fett on the Disney Plus channel. And earlier this week on Reddit, somebody had released what was a synopsis of what the show entails. We know from the interview with Robert Rodriguez that we shared on last week's show that what we've seen in the previews, and we keep getting new 1 minute and 30-second preview clips of the Book of Boba Fett over the course of the past week, we know that it really is only the first 15 minutes of the first episode that we've seen any footage of. And I guess because the rest of the show of episode 1 is filled with spoilers, and they want to hold some stuff back for when we all get to watch it coming up on Wednesday. This particular synopsis that came out was light on spoilers of how the show plays out, but heavy on details of what the actual plot of the Book of Boba Fett was. So, it was, apparently, there was a cease and desist that was put out by Disney to take this down from wherever it originated from. Subsequently, since then, it's been removed from the Reddit leaks page, which adds a little bit of validity to the actual leak synopsis of the Book of Boba Fett. So, if you want no spoilers, skip ahead like a minute. I'm going to keep it really vague, though, and just make one comment. So, this is your warning here.
The hyperdrive is leaking.
All right, if you're still listening, then I'm just going to give you one little tidbit, and that's all, because I don't know how much validity there is to this. You might want to go back and watch Solo, A Star Wars Story. That's all I'm going to say, okay? Based off of this synopsis that came out, you might want to go back and watch Solo before you watch Book of Boba Fett coming up on Wednesday. Okay, now, let's move on. Also leaked this week were some images. This was the Lucasfilm 2021 employee gift. So it's a black box, and on it, it has Lucasfilm. The pretty inside of the box is a Crosley record player. Okay, sort of a stylized, an old style sort of Crosby record player. Okay, so but it comes in this black box. It's encased in this black box. It's got the Lucasfilm Limited official logo on it. On one side of the box, it has the logos for Indiana Jones 5, The Book of Boba Fett, Andor, and Star Wars Obi-Wan Kenobi. Okay, so the movie, and then the three films, the three live-action shows that Disney and Lucasfilm have been working on. On the flips, on the other side of the spine of this box that has this Crosby record player in it, it has the logo for Willow. It has the logo for Star Wars The Bad Batch. It has a logo for Star Wars Visions. Presumably, these are for, again, Lucasfilm employees, and so these are projects that they've all worked on recently. But also, what appears on the other spine, along with Willow, The Bad Batch, and Star Wars Visions, is a logo in yellow, stylized in what looks like one of the original Return of the Jedi logos, with the Star Wars and then the rectangle, and inside the rectangle, in the correct font, it says Tales of the Jedi. That's all we know. So, apparently there is most likely a Disney Plus project that has been worked on, or is being worked on, or maybe even completed. And in that, and that project is called Star Wars Tales of the Jedi. Now, a lot of people are speculating Tales of the Jedi is an older property that now sits in Legends. I believe it was a series of comic books. Considering that it's positioned next to the Bad Batch and Visions, a lot of people are speculating that this could be an animated series. We know that Matt Lanter, who does the voice for Anakin Skywalker in the Clone Wars, has said that he potentially still has more work as Anakin Skywalker. So it could be that. But a lot of people are speculating this is a new Disney Plus animated series. So, again, I get the logic there, but Willow is also on that side of the spine, and that's a live-action, movie for Disney+. So, it seems as if there is an unannounced show that got leaked via this employee gift box called Tales of the Jedi. That's about all we know at this point in time. I'm excited. It involves Jedi. As you know, I love the mythology. I want to get deeper into the mythology. So, for that reason alone, any new Star Wars project is always going to be exciting and of interest to me, and certainly this podcast. And something titled Star Wars Tales of the Jedi has my interest piqued. It'll be interesting to see how soon we get the details on this particular project, especially now that this Lucasfilm employee gift box has been leaked, and people are now talking about it, including this very podcast. All right. Star Wars. Christmas time is Star Wars time, for a number of different reasons, in my opinion. One, before we get into the Lucasfilm era, Star Wars is about, for many of us, it's about family. Those of us who grew up with the original trilogy, having seen it in the theater, were taken to the theater by, our mothers or our fathers or whomever, when we were little. And the experience that we had of seeing this, what became just this massive, the biggest science fiction franchise in the history of mankind. The family element, not only of the storytelling, right? Apart, but also just the family element of what it's done for families. Having seen so many of these films for the first time with my father, and having him come out to visit in 2019 to come see The Rise of Skywalker, all very meaningful for me. But Christmas time is also Star Wars time, because apart from Solo, all the new movies have been released around Christmas. And the Book of Boba Fett's going to fall into that category, being released between Christmas and New Year's. But you look at The Force Awakens, you look at Rogue One, which we're going to talk quite a bit about. You look at The Last Jedi, and again, Solo aside, that was in March, and The Rise of Skywalker. All these films bring about the Christmas spirit for me, as does any number of Christmas movies that I enjoy. Christmas time is Star Wars time. It's my favorite time of year, and Star Wars is my favorite movie franchise of all time. And there are just a lot of parallels between this wonderful thing that George Lucas created for us and the season that we all enjoy, right? And of course, the meaning for the season for me as a Christian, the birth of our Lord and Savior. But the joy that comes with that, with all of the other legends of, Santa Claus and whatnot. So I just wanted to share that on the podcast this week. I actually started watching Rogue One last night a bit, and planning on watching quite a bit of Star Wars once we get past. I'm recording this on Christmas Eve. It'll be released on Christmas Day. We're in total Christmas movie mode right now, but I'm going to spend some time over this Christmas vacation watching Star Wars films, because I want to keep that Christmas spirit alive, through New Year's and beyond, and just praying for a better 2022. And I just find so much enjoyment in these films. I wouldn't do this podcast if I didn't. So, Merry Christmas to you. Happy Life Day. And I hope you are enjoying Star Wars this holiday season, if that also goes and brings you joy.
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
It's fun going on Facebook and seeing the things that were posted when Facebook gives you the opportunity to look back in history in your feed. Over the course of the past week or so, I've been seeing all the posts from all the first times I went out and saw the movies that I just mentioned from the Disney era of Star Wars, and seeing the excitement that I had counting down to Rogue One and The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi and the Rise of Skywalker. And there's been a lot of articles that have been released as of late, both from StarWars.com, but also ILM. And one of the focuses has been the 5-year anniversary, right? 5 years already, my gosh, of Star Wars Rogue One. Or Rogue One, a Star Wars story. So there was an exclusive interview that StarWars.com put out on the 5-year anniversary of the gritty standalone film that I've gone through and picked out some portions of that I wanted to share with you on the show this week. Plus, there's an interview from ILM with the special effects supervisor from the prequels all the way until now, Jon Knoll, and I want to share with you some of the some of the portions of that article, and also my thoughts on it as well. So let's dive into this article from StarWars.com of Gareth Edwards speaking exclusively with StarWars.com. To mark the Rogue One's 5th anniversary, director Gareth Edwards spoke with StarWars.com about sneaking away to his first Lucasfilm meeting, bringing back Tarkin and Leia with digital effects, and Rogue One felt like something we'd borrowed from George. Gareth Edwards says, John Knoll was a hero of mine growing up, getting into visual effects. I always wanted to direct films, but I came through at some point in the industry. If you're not given a directing gig straight from film school, you have to pick a career, and I picked visual effects. I sat and watched the making of The Phantom Menace to death. I savored everything there was about industrial light and magic, ILM, and obviously a lot of that material gravitated to John Knoll. So I felt like he was a massive hero of mine. Then I had a Zoom meeting with him to kind of get the gig, because if he didn't like me, then obviously they'd go with someone else. So I knew that there was a lot of pressure at this meeting. I can't remember any of it. I can't remember how it went. I remember just being nervous. StarWars.com asked, it was only the second film in this new wave of Star Wars productivity at the time, and there's never been a Star Wars spinoff like Rogue One. I'm wondering if there was pressure that came from that, and if it ever got to you during production. Gareth Edwards says, there was pressure. Obviously, there's pressure all the time, every day in every way, so 1,000%. It's a strange thing to say, but for a whole generation of Star Wars was kind of a semi-religion. I think in the past, kids would grow up and be told campfire stories or spiritual, mythical stories, and the religious stories about the world and fantasy ideas that speak about good versus evil. It resonates with you as a child. Those stories kind of grew into religion over 1,000 years. Star Wars took the place of a sort of spiritual foundation for a lot of kids. Weirdly, Star Wars was a very profound thing, I think, for a lot of us. And for a lot of us that grew up in religious households and Christian households, there were a lot of parallels there. And I know my father, had made those parallels with me when I was younger, of the storytelling within Star Wars and good versus evil versus, what we had learned in church and through the Bible. If I had one specialist subject in my life, Gareth goes on to say, it's probably Star Wars: A New Hope. If I had one thing that I always wanted to do more than anything else, it was to make films. I knew what I wanted this film to be. StarWars.com asks, the first time we talked, you were in pre-production. I don't think this made the final cut of our interview, but you had talked about wanting to push forward and take chances with Rogue One because if you didn't, then you weren't creating in the spirit of George Lucas. After I saw it, I felt that with the digitally created performances of Tarka and Leia, you were definitely pushing forward. Tell me about the decision to do that, and if you were worried at all. Gareth says, yeah, I think at some point we put a little chart up on the wall, which was what were the characters we could have in this movie that exist in this timeline. A lot of them were out of bounds. Tarkin was an obvious choice. So we would talk to John Knoll and the team and say, is this possible? Is this crazy? Should we steer from it? And John would always light up and be like, no, this is exactly what ILM is about. This is why we exist. Go for it. We always knew there was probably going to be a hurdle with Leia's shot. We always knew there was probably going to be a Leia shot in some form somewhere, right at the end of the film at least. So they had that technical hurdle to figure out. Greg Fraser, who was a master at lighting, he would have preferred to have done a different kind of lighting on Tarkin for a lot of the shots, but we noticed that if we did a more modern take on that, it didn't feel like him. He had to sort of dial it back to the way they lit the scenes in A New Hope in the late 70s, and then it would start to feel more real. Same thing with Vader. Even the shots of Vader, we did a little test shoot, and Greg would always say the lighting on Vader is like doing a car commercial. He's got a lot more in common with photographing a car than a human because of all the light reflections and things. We keep looking at these tests going. This doesn't feel like Vader, does it? What are we doing wrong? And we started to realize that normally when you do a shot, you do an over-the-shoulder shot and you film someone, and then you do a reverse when you come around for a conversation. In the original trilogy, when they would come around to do the reverse, the person in the foreground would always feel bigger than Vader, which felt wrong. So they always pulled the camera back a little bit and then raised it up so that Vader and his eye line was always the highest thing in frame. If you didn't do that, Vader felt small and not powerful. And so it was all these little tricks that we hadn't thought of until we started failing at certain things. StarWars.com goes and asks about Tarkin. I think what was nice is that I don't remember him being in the trailers at all, and I think that made it have an impact in the theater when you were watching it. And Gareth says, yeah, it's great when publicity understands there are some things you want to hold back on. I think that really helped a lot. StarWars.com asks, my favorite sequence, and I know this is an obvious choice, is the Vader scene at the end of Rogue One as he tears through the rebels. I love the look of it and just how frightening the scene is. What do you recall about conceiving that scene and taking it as far as you did? And Gareth says, it was a last-minute decision. The credit goes to Jabez Olsen, who was an editor on the film. We always wanted Vader in the movie as much as possible without playing that card too much, and at the time it felt like there were some other things in the works, and maybe we should steer clear of Vader a little bit and not abuse that situation. But as the film progressed, it got clearer that this is that story, that if you watch the beginning of A New Hope, he's obviously very pissed. They have these plans, and he wants them desperately back. It feels like he was very intimately involved in some way in the moments that led to them being stolen. So we were always trying to fit him into the end of the film. We talked about a lot of different things early on. There were all sorts of things suggested, like he came down to what became Scarif, and ideas like that. I've got to be careful saying these things because fans sometimes start to think that you shot that moment and it was a genuine thing that existed. But it was a more hypothetical conversation about how we would use him at the end. Then, through just the way things played out, it sort of slipped by that. It had, my apologies here, I'm getting my words jumbled. It had sort of slipped by that we didn't have this T-Rex Jurassic Park moment of the main bad guy coming at the very end. Jabez brought that up and said, we should do this. How about if he's in the sequence that leads to the blockade runner? And I was like, yeah, I'd love to do that, but obviously we're just out of time. So when Kathleen Kennedy came in to look at something, Jabez brought it up to her, and she went, that's a great idea. So suddenly we were allowed to do it. It was a last-minute scramble where we all went to Pinewood a few weeks later, and we were shooting that. It was weird. I felt like we were filming it. I felt like when we were filming it, I didn't realize how significant it would be in the film. I just thought it was a nice cherry on top. I really didn't think it would be what everyone talked about when they talk about the movie. I just thought it was just tying a bow, having a Vader reprise at the end of the story. But then, as time passed, it seems to be the thing people most reference or remember, which I'm very pleased about. But weirdly, when we filmed it, obviously there's Darth Vader in front of you. When he first walks on set, you feel giddy like a little schoolboy for about a half hour. And then suddenly, the stress of filmmaking. Can you move that light? Can you stand over there? What was strange was talking to Vader. Even though it was a stunt guy inside that played Vader, he was very good. You never see him with the mask off, so you're blocking it out. So it feels like you're directing Vader. There's something very strange about that. I felt like I was going to be killed at any moment if I gave him some notes. He was going to force choke me for criticizing a performance or something. You sort of play out your career in your mind and think, I'm never going to do anything that significant again when it means so much to me to get to play in that sandpit with Darth Vader at the end of the film. And obviously, I got my cameo there launching the ship. It really did feel like everything had gone full circle. Like the thing that had inspired us as kids. One of the crew members brought his original R2-D2 and C-3PO. We put them on the floor of the blockade runner and took a picture. It was a bit like this is where it all began. This is where we all started with filmmaking. Technically, on this very set. It was sort of emotional for us. It was a spiritual homecoming in a weird way. Fans have latched on to the ragtag crew of Rogue One, they ask, and I'm wondering if that has been especially rewarding to see. And Gareth says, yeah, of course. But I don't know what that means, because when you make a film, even if you make a terrible film, people come up to you and say, oh, that was really good. like someone says something complimentary thing about the film I've been involved in. I just feel like they're being nice. So I can't really get an objective take on how well Rogue One has done over time. I'm glad that people don't seem to hate it. The biggest fear was that we were going to ruin their childhood by reinventing or baking into canon what they imagined was something else. So I'm more relieved, if anything, that people don't hate the movie if they're not shouting at me from across the street. And, it's interesting, too, and I think that's one of the things that lends itself to the success of Rogue One was that, nobody had ever really thought about what that story was of stealing the Death Star plans. I know there were some stories that were written that are now legends that told that story, but that wasn't anything that the fandom, I think, had really latched onto. So they were able to have some creative license without having to worry about the baggage of headcanon of fans who thought that the stealing of the Death Star plans pre A New Hope was supposed to play out a different way. StarWars.com asked, do you have any regret of not having the heroes survive to have more adventures down the road? And Gareth says, no, I'm really pleased that they all died, he laughs, as bad as that sounds. They don't appear anywhere else in the trilogy, so if they had lived and had any sort of significant story in terms of their lives, it would have been strange for them not to have a fleeting glimpse somewhere in the original trilogy. I remember when Disney chairman and CEO Bob Iger stood out on stage and announced the film. It was some event at some point, and they put up pictures of all the actors. I can't remember how many there were. There were like 8 or 9 of them. I remember he was talking about it and talking about the movie very briefly. And I remember looking at all those faces and going, I wonder how everyone would feel if he also added at the end, by the way, everyone on this stage you're looking at dies at the end of the film. All of them will be dead. It's not a very Disney thing to do, although Disney does like to kill off parents a lot. So I was really excited that they never, ever brought it up or questioned it. It never became a thing. And I think it makes it more mythical. These characters came together and then can't come together again, really in the same way. Probably helped the movie in some way. It's hard to think of a big studio film where all the central characters died. That's a family movie. That's an element that I'm quite proud of, because to be honest, it feels true to the subject matter, which is essentially war. If we were telling a World War II story about a group of friends or enemies that got together to defeat a common foe, it's really like they wouldn't have made it out alive. It felt more truthful to have a bittersweet ending where the moral of the story was there's a lot of loss that occurs trying to fight whoever it is for whatever reason. Think really hard about it before you do, because there's a good chance you won't come home. I'm sort of happy that we have that feeling in the film because I think it's true. That was a quite deep and dark answer. He goes on to say, StarWars.com says, that's fine. It works for a couple of reasons, which is the movie doesn't take the easy way out, but it also ends with the idea that what they did was for hope, as Leia says. StarWars.com asks, with that, it keeps very much in line with what Star Wars has always tried to teach. And Gareth says, yeah, that's the dilemma, isn't it? It's when, if you don't take a stand against certain things, those things will win out. And you can't let that happen. That's unfolding in such a bad thing for society. StarWars.com says and asks, all right, I guess this is the last question. I'm curious to hear your answer. And no pressure, but would you ever make another Star Wars movie? And he says, oh, gosh, I think it's amazing to be offered it once in your life. It's like going to the moon. I got to land on the moon. I'm very happy about that. So I need to step aside and let someone else carry the legacy. Also, in doing it, I felt like it was never my film. It always felt like it was something we borrowed from George. You see the iconography everywhere. Disney has been very good with all the merchandise that came out around the films. All I remember probably in the late 90s as a Star Wars fan was if you wanted to buy a Star Wars t-shirt or a bag or a pencil or something with C-3PO on it, you probably couldn't. In all the shops you'd go in, you wouldn't see anything really. Then in the last few years, you're getting on a plane and all these kids are in front of you and they have Star Wars bags and t-shirts and coats. I feel like maybe the new future of Star Wars is kind of passing the torch. Rather than one person defining it all, it's this thing that's lots of artists and filmmakers that can play and bring their voice too. Like we see different versions of that world. I think it's more exciting. It's like in the U.S. where you can only be president for 2 terms. That's a good thing. I think it's exciting to have new filmmakers come along and give a fresh spin. And you know what? That's one of the things that I love about the sequel trilogy. Even though J.J. Abrams did The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker, those are very 2 different films. And I feel like with The Rise of Skywalker, J.J. and Chris Terrio really went out of their way to do something a little bit different that still kept in the spirit of Star Wars. And it didn't work for everybody, but it worked for this fan. It's kind of like Matrix Resurrections, and I just put out a brand new space opera podcast. It's another podcast that I do here on My Nerd World. If you search My Nerd World, the space opera podcast, you'll find it. And while Matrix, those films aren't a space opera, in my opinion, they carry many of the same themes, even if they're grounded on Earth. And I'm a big Matrix fan, and I liked Matrix Resurrections. But Matrix Resurrections also has, it takes a lot of risks and is very different, even though it's the same director. But I agree with Gareth Edwards here. I like the fact that we have different types of Star Wars. The Last Jedi has a very different feel from The Rise of Skywalker. Even though it's the same director, it has a very different feel from The Force Awakens, which also has a different feel from the prequels and the original trilogy. And I think that is also the path forward. Even though it's going to create unique and different art, Disney and Lucasfilm have to accept the fact that that's also going to be very divisive, and that's an okay thing. From ILM, I'll share with you also on the podcast this week, John Knoll discussing the technology and innovation of Rogue One, a Star Wars story. John, the whole idea of Rogue One started with you. How long had you been thinking of this idea before it was greenlit? And John Knoll says, I started thinking about this all the way back on Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. I was on the set we were shooting in Sydney, and I think we were waiting for some setup to happen. I started chatting with Rick McCallum, who was producing the film, and he mentioned that he and George were developing a Star Wars live-action series, and that they were working on scripts. I started thinking about all the interesting tales you could tell in a show like that, and one of the first things that popped into my head was, what about a mission, impossible-style operation, to break into the most secure facility in the Galactic Empire to steal the plans for the Death Star? I started toying with that idea along with a few others, and I approached Rick again to learn more about the time period they wanted to set the show in. And I realized that none of my ideas would apply to that period, so I shelved it. Well, you flash forward to 2012 after Lucasfilm's acquisition of the Walt Disney Company, and George selected Kathleen Kennedy to lead Lucasfilm, and our announcement of the continuation of the Skywalker saga. What we also announced then was what I was really intrigued about were more spin-off films. The first one we announced internally was Solo, and I got excited about where these spin-off films could go because of the possibilities were endless. As a bit of a joke, I started pitching an updated version of my story that went, picture a SEAL Team 6 in the Star Wars universe, and they're going on this desperate high-stakes mission to break into the most secure facility in the Galactic Empire to steal the plans for the Death Star. What about that? People would go, oh, that actually sounds cool. So I started having this conversation with a number of people, and every time I pitched it, it would start to add more detail. It would get bigger and bigger. Kind of a mental exercise. I asked myself, well, if we're serious about this, who are the main characters? What are their arcs? What is the plot structure? How does this start, and how does it end? I remember a specific moment where I was at this annual charity trivia game that we do, and I was on the team with a couple of friends, and we had about an hour over dinner while we were waiting for it to begin. And Kim Libery said, tell me about the Star Wars story idea that you have. So I pitched him the half-hour version of it with every detail, and at the end he goes, you've got to pitch this to Kathy. At that point, I realized I had to do this, because if I didn't, I would always wonder what could have been. So I called up Kathy and made an appointment. I think it took maybe 6 weeks to find a time to meet with her and Carrie Hart from the Lucasfilm Story Group. I spent those 6 weeks writing up a really detailed treatment with all of the character descriptions. When the day came, I brought my treatment in, sat down with Kathy and Carrie, and just dove into the pitch and all the characters. They listened very politely to the whole thing. Kathy told me she was impressed with the story, and that was basically it. I didn't hear anything for a few days, and at that point I was like, well, I did it. At least for now, I don't have to think and wonder. About a week later, I got a call from Kiri, and she goes, Kathy and I have been discussing your story a lot, and I think we want to proceed with this. I was so elated. And one of the crazy things that the first spinoff was supposed to be was Solo, but Larry Kasdan got pulled into development for The Force Awakens. And out of all the spinoffs that they were tinkering with, Rogue One got slotted up to take its place in the queue. It was pretty surreal. Getting back to a few more things from this article where they get into some of the details that I wanted to share with you that I thought were interesting. Is it true the escape pods were visibly jettisoned during the shot of the Hammerhead Corvette plummeting into the shield gate as it's embedded in the Star Destroyer? And John Knoll says, that's true. They survived. In my headcanon, the crew survived. We put lifeboats on the hammerhead in a pretty prominent way, and at one point, we did have a shot of the escape pods jettisoning, but it became a bit of a distraction for what the point of the shot was. The idea is that they got out before it hit the shield gate. It did, yeah. In fact, at one point, I met with Pablo Hidalgo from Lucasfilm Story Group and basically asked him what type of ships might make up the Rebel fleet at this point in history. That way we could start building them. You also brought Hera Syndulla's ship from Rebels, the Ghost, into the film. What was the process of bringing a ship from animation to live action? We got the geometry for both the Hammerhead Corvette and the Ghost from the animation folks. Owning to the medium, they were built on a much simpler level of detail, with some aspects being a bit caricatured for animation style. We slimmed the Ghost down and made the movie version of it with a fairly extensive detail pass. Then he goes on to talk about the number of characters that were brought back from the original trilogy to the end of the film. He says, if you think about it, we brought back a number of characters, and we used every technique to do it. Incorporating unused footage of Red Leader and Gold Leader was that final technique. It was discussed very early about how this film was going to meet up right at the end of A New Hope. We thought about how a lot of these people at the Battle of Scarif would have participated in the Battle of Yavin 2, so we should have some familiar faces. It was hard to avoid Red Leader and Gold Leader, so we decided to look through the dailies of A New Hope to see if we could find anything. It was super fun to do, but it was a lot harder than it looks, because the lighting style was pretty different back then, and the footage was really grainy and had faded. So, trying to get a shot from 40 years earlier and drop it into the film without looking off was a challenge. We degrained it. We did lots of roto masks. The orange color of the flight suits had to be boosted. One thing we discovered during the process was that the digital X-Wing cockpits we created were true and faithful to what the exterior looked like. I never noticed it before, but the cockpits that George created had some huge cheats in their interior dimensions. The back window, for example, was made very tall so George could get the shots of Luke looking get the shots looking over Luke at R2. Ours didn't match that at all, and it would have been a jarring jump between the digital cockpits and the archival cockpits. So we had to rotoscope around Red Leader and then insert him into the digital cockpit. Was there any discussion about including Wedge Antilles in the Battle of Scarif? We discussed whether or not he should be in the battle, yes, but Wedge has a great line from A New Hope, and he says, look at the size of that thing. So it's implied that he's never seen the Death Star in person. We wanted to preserve that. Matthew Wood at Skywalker Sound actually brought David Ankrum, who overdubbed the voice of Wedge Antilles, played by both Dennis Lawson and Colin Higgins in A New Hope, to voice Wedge again. If you listen to the comms chatter when the fleet is being scrambled, that's Wedge telling the flight personnel to report and direct to Scarif. I just love backstories, and I love documentaries, but I love the backstories on these films. It adds a lot more depth to them when you hear from the creators of the story and the special effects and the amount of love and care that goes into the film. And I think that's why we end up loving these films so much, because there was a lot of heart and soul and time and effort that went to make these films great. And that's why they are great and unique and special in their own way. And why I can couple that with Christmas time, bringing the podcast full circle, right? Because these stories are special and they are timeless. And so is the story of the birth of Jesus Christ and the story of Santa Claus and Frosty the Snowman, and they all bring about those feelings of joy. I hope you're having a joyous holiday season. I hope you're getting to spend a lot of time with your family, and like I say on every show, and certainly, means something special on this particular episode, I hope wherever you are, that you are happy, you are healthy, and that you are safe. If you want to support My Nerd World and the Star Wars podcast, go to mynerdworld.net and check out my science fiction space opera series, EMBARK. 6 books available in ebook, paperback, hardback, and audiobook. Great for all ages 11, 12 years old and up. Think Star Wars in terms of the content of violence and themes. Good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny, strong family values. Young and old have enjoyed my stories, and I'm so grateful for that. And if you haven't checked them out, you can go to Amazon.com and search for EMBARK. Jon, Jon Justice, or mynerdworld.net and pick up your preferred version of the stories and give yourself the gift of science fiction space opera to read this holiday season. Again, Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and we'll be back again next week for the last podcast of 2021. Then, bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.